Hello there, my name is Jesse Josh and welcome to another literature in English class. Right. So in the last class we talked about, in the last two classes we've been talking about the types of poems that we have, or the types of poetry, however you'd like to call it, right? So we're going to continue on that in this class, and then, we'll probably, if we can, we'll round off today. If we cannot, we'll take the rest of them in the next class. All right, but before we go into it, let's take a recap of all the poems we have treated so far. And if I'm not going to say everything I said, so if you missed a video, please go back and watch the video. Thank you very much. All right, so we talked about the types of poem. We've treated the lyric. We've treated the lyric, which we said is a musical poem, right? A musical poem that is sung with the accompaniment of a musical instrument called, yes, the lyre. And we talked about the sonnet, yes. I'm saying it in the order in which I remember. I'm not basically saying it in the order with which I taught it, right? So we talked about the sonnets. We talked about how the sonnet is a 14-line poem and how there are 4 types of a sonnet, right? The Petrarchan sonnet, the Elizabethan sonnet, the Miltonic sonnet, and the Spenserian sonnet. We talked about the differences between the sonnets, the rhyme scheme, and how they are divided. The Petrarchan sonnet divided into 2 parts, an octave or an octet, right? And then it's sets. Octave of 8 lines, sets, 6-line poem, right? We talked about the rhyme scheme, which you have to go back to the other video to watch. Then we talked about the Elizabethan sonnets, or the Shakespearean sonnet, which is the poem named after Shakespeare. It's divided into 2 parts, 4 parts basically, 3 sets of quatrains and a rhyming couplet, right? With the rhyme scheme that you have to find out in the next or in the previous video. Then we talked about the Spenserian sonnet, who was actually the first person to start the whole division of 4 parts, 3 sets of quatrains and a rhyming couplet, right? And then he has an entirely different rhyme scheme from that of the Shakespearean sonnet. Then we said that the Miltonic sonnet has no special feature. It's just an offshoot or a variation of the Petrarchan sonnet. All right. We also talked about the narrative poem, how that a narrative poem is a story. We're going to mention that again in the other poems we're going to talk about today. So how a narrative poem tells a story, basically. We talked about the dramatic poem, how a dramatic poem is a poem that is in form of a drama, or is read like you are reading a drama. All right. We also talked about the dirge and the elegy, and we made a distinction between them, how the elegy focuses generally on negative emotions, and how the dirge basically focuses on mourning, a poem that mourns a dead person or the death of a person. We talked about the ode, how an ode is gotten from the Greek word aiding, meaning to chant or to sing. So an ode is basically a praise poem. We also talked about the pastoral poem from the word pastor, shepherd, and then we talked about how that poem highlights and expresses the beauty of nature and rural life. All right. So today we're going to be going into some other types of poems, right? I don't want to list them because I don't know. I might go more than or less than a set particular, depending on how long I take to explain the poems. Now, we're going to be treating the ballad, right? The ballad, right? Now, a ballad is under the narrative poem. I forgot to mention when I was telling you about the narrative poem that the narrative poem has about 2 of them under it, the ballad and the epic. Now, the ballad is a narrative poem, right? Of course, narrative, it tells a story, right? But the story it tells is much different, right? In that it tells a story in a particular way. It tells stories on specific things like betrayal, anger, love, cruelty, royalty, and all those themes, right? It varies on themes like that. You get? So a ballad basically tells a story. All right. One thing you have to know about the ballad is that it is regarded as one of the longest forms of poetry, right? Originally poems were basically used to tell story. They were basically used to tell stories, right? And a ballad is usually these stories that are passed down from generation to generation through word of mouth, right? Yeah, so it's a story. Now the stories are usually very, very anonymous. There is no specific author of this story, right? It's just a story basically that's in form of a poem, right? So I told you that it focuses on love, betrayal, anger, parental issues and everything. So it tells a story about that, all right? It's very basically regarded as one of the oldest forms of narrative poem. So that is what a ballad is. All right, the next kind of poem we're going to be looking at is the epic, right? Now, the epic is also a form of a narrative poem. And when we say a narrative poem, we are talking about, of course, like I said earlier, it tells a story. But the kind of story that an epic tells is quite different. An epic tells a story on conquest, right? Conquest, basically. So, when you talk about conquest, you're talking of victories over war, right? Wars fought, kingdoms taken, cities taken, right? So an epic basically focuses on war, right, and conquest. So you see an epic. Now, one thing about narrative poems, like I said, that they are not your average poems, right? They are not, poems that you sing. Although you can sing them, the ballad is actually meant to be sung, basically, but the point of the whole narrative poem is that it tells a story, and nobody likes a short story. Nobody, right? So you probably want a story that's very, very long. So a narrative poem, which has the ballad and the epic, does just that. So an epic is a very long poem. Now, there's one poem I'd like to recommend that everybody go read. The poem is it's called Beowulf. Beowulf, Beowulf. That's an epic, one of the best epic poems to exist. And The Proud King. Now, those epic, they are very long but interesting. You will forget the fact that you're actually reading a poem. Okay, that's how awesome those poems are. So please go home and in your spare time try to read the Beowulf and the Proud King. You would enjoy it. Trust me, if I say you enjoy something, you will enjoy it, because I'm not a boring person. So that's that about that. So the epic is basically a poem focusing on conquest. So you'll probably be expecting things like a war between a monster. Now, funnily, the thing about this epic poem is that they portray things that are very supernatural. They portray supernatural events. So if you happen to read Beowulf, you'll see that they are fighting against a beast that is so illogical. Even when I was reading the poem, my mind was, how does this kind of beast even exist? Right? The beast killed, and then a hero came up and then fought the beast. However, the beast killed the hero, but the hero also made sure that he died with the beast, basically, right? So that is what an epic usually looks like. It is epic. So see, when you say I'm watching an epic movie, you know what we're talking about, yeah. So relate that to an epic poetry, right? So it's a poem that tells a story. The next form of poem that we're going to be looking at is the limerick. The limerick. Now, the limerick is a very funny, mark my words or read my lips, a very funny 5-line poem, right? It is basically 5 lines. Chikena, 5 lines. Now, the thing about this poem is that even though it is 5 lines, it makes up for its shortness in using very creative and witty words. Yeah, it uses very witty words. So you would have to be very, very witty and very, you must be someone that reads in between the lines to understand the joke. You get, you don't explain joke to people. Don't ever explain a joke to somebody. You get it, right? So you have to be very, very witty and smart to understand the joke. So because it's just 5 lines. So imagine a joke told in 5 lines. You expect that there are very, very creative words that are used. Now, finally, the thing about this poem is that the words used in this poem, for the sake of its shortness, it could be vulgar. There could be sensual words being used in this 5-line poem. But it's a very funny. Now, another name for the limerick is called a nonsense verse. What I call it? A nonsense verse. And why is it called a nonsense verse? Because basically it has no... it's nonsense, basically, right? It's scattered. So the first, second, and 5th verse rhyme, while the 3rd and the 4th do not rhyme with the 1st, 2nd, and 5th, but the 3rd and the 4th rhyme together. Did you get what I just said? So I'll take it again. The verses of, remember I told you there are 5 lines, okay? Now the first line, the 2nd line, and the 5th line all rhyme together, while the 3rd and the 4th rhyme together. So yeah, so you probably have 1st, 2nd, having first, second, and fifth having the same rhyme scheme, right? So maybe it will be A, B, B, or sorry, A, B, B, A. So the first, the second, and the fifth line rhymes together. So that is basically what the limerick is about. It's a nonsense verse. It's called a nonsense verse. If you don't remember anything, remember that a limerick is called a nonsense verse. The next kind of poem we're going to be looking at is the lullaby. Now, something probably wrong in your head now. The lullaby. Now, a lullaby is basically a poem that is sung. It is sung to children. Yes, the past participle is sung. Yeah, sung, not sang. It's sung to children. Okay, it's sung to children. Now, people have come up with the misconception that it's only sung to children to make them sleep. That is a big lie. Okay, so not all lullabies make them sleep. Although the aim of a lullaby is to put the child in a relaxed mood, which definitely, or in some cases, leads to sleep, right? So not all of the lullabies are basically meant to. Some children are stubborn. If you like, sing lullaby from now to tomorrow, they will not sleep. You get? But basically, so you see a mother trying to pet her baby that is crying, and then she's singing, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Basically, most children will not sleep, especially bad children. But the point of the mother singing that song is to put the child or the baby, in a relaxed state, right? In a relaxed mood. Now that relaxed mood can now push the baby to sleep. Do you get? So it's basically sung to children, and it's basically sung for children. That's what a lullaby is. So I'm sure you have a lot of examples in your head, right? Whatever. You know, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. It followed her to school one day, school one day, school one day. It followed her to school one day, which was against the rule. Blah, blah, blah. Continue it in your spare time. All right, so I'm going to go to the next kind of poem that we have. And this kind of poem is called a villanelle. Sounds like vanilla, right? Yeah. But it's called a villanelle, right? Okay, what's a villanelle? Well, a villanelle is basically similar to the limerick, and of course, it's musical. Now, before I go on fully into the villanelle, let me point out that the limerick is very musical. Of course, a baby will not sleep if you are not singing, right? Or a baby will not even be in a relaxed mood if you are not singing. Very, very rare babies keep quiet from crying when you are talking to them. You have to do better than that. You have to sing or make some noise, right? And if you're just talking to them, the cry will increase. You get? But basically, you could just sing or make a noise, or do some. You know what to do when your babies are crying. Me, I don't know. I'm just giving examples. So the villanelle is basically a musical poem, which puts it under what kind of poem? Of course, the lyric, right? It puts it under the kind. It's very, very musical. All right. Another thing you have to know about the villanelle is that, I said it was similar to the limerick, right? The basic difference is that a limerick is just 5 lines, right? But the villanelle is 19 lines, right? 19 lines. It has what we call a refrain. We're going to treat this in the elements or features of a poem or features of poetry, right? I'll tell you what a refrain is, but let me just basically explain what it is now. A refrain is repeating the line, a particular line or phrase in a poem. So you can have I'll probably think about that later. Maybe when I'm explaining refrain, I'll make sure to come with an example. But it has a refrain. Now, the first lines and the third line of a villanelle rhymes together, and it ends with what? A rhyming couplet. So I'll take it again in case you missed it. Now, a villanelle is similar to the limerick. The difference is that it has 19 lines, right? It contains a refrain, or it contains refrains, right? And it has the first line and the third line rhyming together and ends in a rhyming couplet. It ends in a rhyming couplet. That is basically what a villanelle is all about. All right, so let's take one more poem and see if we can call it one or two more, and then we'll call it a day. All right, the next type of praise we'll be looking at is the panegyric. Now, panegyric, not panebita, panegyric, okay? All right, so now the panegyric is very similar. What I mean very similar, it's very similar to the ode or the ode, right? So it's similar to the ode. Remember that I told you that an ode is a praise poem, right? It's a praise poem. A panegyric is also a praise poem, right? It praises people, it praises a group, you can praise a person, people, or a hero, basically. It praises the heroic deeds of a person or a people or a community, right? It could also even be addressed to animals, things, entities. So, but the difference between a panegyric and an ode is that a panegyric could be praising something that is positive, negative, or something that is even weird. You're wondering, why would you be praising? Some animals have very funny features. So a panegyric will want to praise that feature, right? Even though it's very funny or very weird. It could even be negative. A panegyric has a way of praising something that is negative, right? It will so highlight it and make it seem like a good thing, right? So that's the difference. An ode basically highlights the positive features and praise it. It's just to, now a panegyric eulogizes the get. A panegyric is to eulogize. So it ignore all the negative thing and, praise the person to a point of elevation. Do you understand? So that's what a panegyric is about. That's what makes it different from an ode. An ode is just basically to praise the characteristics of somebody or something, right? Good. But a panegyric eulogizes, right? Also, you could, I would not say it's an oriki, but you could use that but animals don't have oriki, you get, right? Because, so that's what makes it different from the ode. Right, so but the panegyric is much, much different. All right, so the next and the final poem we're going to be looking at today is the blank verse or free verse. Now, this poem is very simple. I'm sorry if you don't take anything out of this class, take this poem out of this class, right? So it's a blank verse or a free verse. What does that suggest to you? It means that this verse has no particular rhyme scheme, if it even has at all. Right, so it has no rhyme scheme. It is a very free verse. It could be anything. The rhyme scheme is scattered. It is not in an orderly, or it is not distinct. Right, it's not definite. It's just anyhow. It is free. It is blank. There is no specific rhyme scheme. Okay. All right, so that will be all for today's class. I hope you've learned something. But before we go, let's take a recap of what we have done. We have one more poem, or a few more poetry, or a few more types of poem to take before we end the topic on types of poetry, and then we'll move to something else. So let's take a recap of what we did today. We treated the lullaby, right? A poem sung to children to put them in a more relaxed sleep, not necessarily to sleep, even though the relaxed mood can make them sleep. We talked about the panegyric, an ode, and a poem of praise, right? Highlighting features that could be positive, negative, or somewhat weird. Okay. We talked about the ode. Right? We talked about the ode. That was not even this class. It was in the previous class. We talked about the limerick, the nonsense verse, right? We talked about how it is a very, very funny and witty poem, right? The language could be vulgar. It could be vulgar. We talked about the epic and the ballad, which are both types or variations of a narrative poem, which we treated 2 classes before. We talked about how the ballad tells a story based on themes like war, love, anger, hatred, betrayal, while epic tells a story basically on conquest. So what you're expecting from an epic poem is conquest. Basically, you're expecting war between cities, between people, and then you're expecting somebody to write a poem about the victories that must have been gotten in that story. Okay, so basically that was all we treated for today. And in the next class, we'll treat the remaining parts of the poem, and then we'll be done with the types of poem that we have in poetry. So till our next class, please watch this video, ask for questions and contributions. They are all welcome. I'll see you in the next class. Thank you for watching.